So I'd like to tell something about my research on sustainability, quality of life and values. A study that I did among two Anabaptist groups, the Amish and the Hutterites, and two Catholic orders, the Benedictine order and the Franciscan order. Well, I have 20 minutes just to give kind of a summary of my dissertation, so I will just highlight things. But why these issues? I mean, that sustainability has to do with quality of life and our worldview. I think I don't have to convince you here. And that studying communities is valuable. I think I don't have to convince you here too. So, but why these communities? I think that's an interesting question. And one person who kind of triggered me was Lynn White. You may know him. He has written an article in Science in the 60s about the historical roots of our ecological crisis, as he called it. And in this article, and I tell it very shortly, but he talks about our worldview, our Christian worldview, that had influence on the rise of science and technology. And he describes how science and technology influenced the environmental impact. And I say it very short here, very briefly, but he said, if we see that religious part, our worldview, what we see as important as a cause of environmental problems. He said then it should also be the way to find a solution. So we should not just add only more science or more technology, but he said we should go back and rethink our worldview, rethink our religion. And that was what triggered me to search within the Christian culture, within the Christian religion, to values that might be hidden, but that might lead to sustainability. And that's where I ended up with these 4 communities. There might have been more, but I like these communities because they exist for quite a long time, for centuries. And these communities do have a low impact on several points. Not all. None of these groups is completely environmentally sound, but they appear to keep their quality of life for centuries. And I thought that's an interesting thing in itself. And also the choices they make, which have a low impact on the environment, are motivated by values. And these values might be interesting for broader society. So what I'm going to do this 15 minutes is just tell something briefly about these 4 communities. Then, how have they been sustainable in keeping their quality of life? And then a third is which values might be interesting for us. And I just mentioned about 4. There are more, but I choose 4. And I'll finish with just 3 things I think we can learn as broader society. So first the Amish. Well, the Amish may not be sustainable in the sense that they have big families. But they, I think they have a lot of things that might be triggering us. The Amish are an Anabaptist group. They started in 1693. Actually, the Anabaptist movement started just after the Reformation, beginning of the 16th century, but it is a kind of a split. And they're well known because of their horse and buggies, not using electricity, not for environmental reasons, but because they want their community. And they said, we don't want a car because when we own a car, we might scatter our community. We're not longer dependent on the community. Important Amish values are the respect for tradition, family security, devotion, humility, obedience. And they translate it to a very simple lifestyle, small-scale agriculture. Although in Lancaster, where I did my field work, I lived 3 months with them, you see that more and more businesses start. And actually in Lancaster, not even half of the Amish live primarily from agriculture. They do have businesses. You see a lot of developments among the community. And it's very interesting to see how they deal with their values to keep their community, to keep their quality of life. I'll come back to that later. Nowadays there are about 270,000 Amish in America and Canada. They have a retention rate of 85%. So 85% of their youth decides to stay Amish. That's high. The second one is the Hutterites. I spent 6 weeks there in Forest River Colony in North Dakota and visited several Canadian colonies. The Hutterites are also Anabaptists. It's more the Austrian part of the Anabaptists. They started there. And their characteristics are shared property and a communal possessions. So they don't have private property, they have communal owned property. And nowadays they also live in Canada and in the US. What's interesting among the Hutterites is that their values are primarily in their daily life. So their daily life is very simple, very sober. They share all things, they eat all dinners together, they share everything. But their agriculture is very modern, it's huge, it's very high-tech. And when I asked them about that, like what are your main values and how do you see them in their agriculture? They say, well, it's kind of dualistic there. They said, well, our farms are for just earning money, and in order to be able to pay our colonial life, which is our quality of life. So for them, where the Amish translate their values in their businesses and in their farming systems, you see among the Hutterites more a dualistic system. And that's, I thought, was very interesting. But you also see that it creates kind of conflicts within the group, particularly among the youth, where their faith is based on very old sermons, 16th century sermons, but their businesses are very high-tech. The third one, the Franciscans. The Franciscan order may be known as the Green Order, the Green Saint, but I think that the Franciscans, their first contribution to the sustainability discussion is that he was a poverello. He was choosing poverty. He was choosing a life of simplicity, poverty, and I think he can be characterized by gratitude and respect towards people, towards nature, humility. And when I talked to the modern monks and poor clerics, I stayed some months with the Franciscan monasteries, and they also struggled, like, how do we translate nowadays our vow for poverty into, well, our present day actions. Interesting. The fourth group, the Benedictines and particularly the Trappists, because the Trappists still have agriculture. They're well known, of course, because of their, what we say, ora et labora. You won't find that in the rule literally, but it's the combination of work and prayer and lectio divina. You find it in the Franciscans as well, but not as much as among the Benedictines. They're focused on study and science. Well, the first question was, how did they maintain the quality of life? And I found three things that were important. First of all, they have a shared worldview. All these communities share a worldview. When they enter the community, they use a rite. I mean, the monks have a vow. The Anabaptists are baptized. There's a ritual. And they know what the worldview, what it's about. They know the norms, they know the rules, they know what it's about, and they share it, and they celebrate it regularly, some daily, some weekly, where they have celebrations and they share these roots. And I think that's very important for their continuation of the quality of life. So it's shared, and all their actions, in the end, are rooted in this worldview. Even though, if you ask nowadays why an Amish wears the clothes he wears, he says, well, it's just Amish. It has become part of their identity. But if you go back, you see that it traces back to their shared worldview. The second one is the social capital. All the communities have a very strong social capital, the context. They make a context in which they can make the choices they do. In our society, as an individual, it might be very hard to make certain choices, to have certain environmental choices. But they have a structure in which the economy and the social context can be as it is. And they work on it. And the third one is the reflective change. All these groups do change. None of these groups are the same as a century ago. Some people think the Amish haven't changed, but they do. They do change a lot, actually, the last 2 to 20 years. But they do it in a reflective way. And I think that's very interesting. I'll come back to that one when I talk about the values, I think. Yes. They have reflection, communal reflection on what constitutes quality of life and what choices they make. And if the consequences of their choices or of an innovation has negative consequences for their quality of life, they might say no. Or they might say, well, we might, now I know what it is. I have slides, that's why I have no computer before me. That's the shared worldview. This is the rule. The second one is the social capital, with a marvelous example of the barn raising of the Amish. And this is the third, the reflective change. And I had an example of the Trappists in West Vleteren. You might know that they have the best beer of the world. And it is chosen the best beer. And when it was the case, they could have chosen to rise up the production because they live from it. It's an economic source. And as St. Benedict says, they all have to take care of their own economics. So, but they didn't. They said, we just have the amount of beer we have because we want to have time left for our prayers and for our reflection time, our Lectio Divina. And this is an example of limiting themselves to this production in order to keep time for what for them is really important, their time of reflection. And you see this principle among the Amish as well. They have a lot of changes, but in every change they think about what are the consequences for our quality of life. So, to mention some values that might be interesting for us, I want to mention 4, and the first one is the stability. That's the vow of the Benedictines and the Trappists, the vow of stability, stabilitas, that you choose to commit yourself to a certain place, not only to an order, but also to a place. And it has led to sustainable use of the fields, sustainable use of the buildings, because they wanted to keep it for the monks to come after them. The other one is the moderation. All these groups limit themselves in material goods because they say when we choose for moderation or simplicity, it helps us to gain more spiritual wealth. And they're convinced that quality of life is not in possessing more things, but in having more spiritual depth. In all these groups you see the same. Actually, they say when we have too much materialism, it may prevent us from going to spiritual depth. Moderation. The fourth one is the humility. You see it among the monasteries particularly. And I liked a Benedictine abbot telling me that when you look at the word humility, it shares the roots with the word humus, ground, field. And he said it's about knowing that you as a human are made of the ground of the earth. Like it says in the Bible, Adam, it means red earth. So that you as a human are part of creation. And it makes that you're not arrogant in exploiting the earth, but that you know your place. Humility is knowing your place towards God and towards other people and towards creation. And the last one is the reflection itself. I think in our society we have a 24/7 economy, and we really miss the rest, the time for reflection. And that's what I found among all these groups, and they organize it. Because you really have to organize time for reflection. It's not something that comes from our nature, I think. So they all have a context in which they organize that you have reflection. And I think that's a value that we can learn from as a broader society. And that brings me to my conclusions or 3 inspiring principles, as you may say, for sustainability for our broader society. Not that we have to copy or can copy their choices because they're rooted in their worldview, but I think they may trigger us. And the first one is that we should not focus as society on more quantity, which leads to a growth of consumerism, growth of production, but we should focus on quality. And I think that counts for everything, in our materialism, but also in our relations, in how we deal with time, that we choose quality instead of quantity, and I think that will lead to a more sustainable world. The second one is that we need community building. We need communities for that. The environmental problem, I learned that we cannot say environmental problem, but I still do, is called a social dilemma. For many people, 70% in the Netherlands say it's a social dilemma. I mean, when I make a choice which is good for the environment, but all the others don't, I'm not willing to make that choice. That's the social dilemma. And you need communities or a way of community to break through that. So we need other people to define the values, to define our quality of life, and also to stimulate each other to make these choices. And this community can be on a small scale, but I think we also need it among businesses, for example. That businesses have contracts with other businesses, covenances with governments, for example. Because nobody wants to be the first, because of economic reasons. And that's why I think you have to look further and to define quality of life, where you're making your policy for in the long term. And that's why community is necessary at all levels. It's also, I think, needed for practical reasons. And that's why I'm happy that you see, at many levels, you see community building already. Like, for example, CSA, the communities of food, where people participate in farms, or cooperatives for windmills. This is a right colony, by the way, where they have windmills. So we also need communities for the practical side. And the last one is we need reflectiveness in the change. And I hope that, we, as we go home again, or also in our academic work, in our personal lives, that we find reflectiveness, because we really need reflectiveness to get a sustainable future. Thank you.